Thank you so much, Claes, and thank you for inviting me here. One thing, of course, Claes didn't mention in terms of the greatest honor I received was, I think, about 15 years ago, I became also an adjunct professor here of the University of Southern Denmark. And it's just great to be back and see the exciting new initiatives, the DDC, DS, and new amazing buildings springing up here. So it's really wonderful to be back, and I hope I can be back more often through my link with the DDC. I'm looking forward to that. So what I'm going to be talking about today is not so much about parties directly, but rather sort of shifting my focus to voters, and a phenomenon that we know about in a number of countries, perhaps particularly the United States, but also in Europe, also in the country that I have made my home, the United Kingdom, which is this polarizing effect, not just polarization politically, ideologically, but polarization between groups that make us dislike each other in a very emotional way. These two illustrations, one is from the Capitol attack on January 6th in the United States, where some have argued that the fact that there are these polarizing, affective polarization between Democrats and Republicans even led to an uprising, and many are worried about what's happening now in the States leading into the next presidential election. Some have thought about the part of this polarization that we've seen in the US, but there's also evidence that this is something we see in many other political systems. It's because we are increasingly living in echo chambers. We surround ourselves with like-minded people who think like us. Perhaps they have sort of similar education, similar outlooks in life. And if we only ever hear and see people who are like us, we maybe start thinking that the other side, you know, they are bigoted, they're wrong, they are morally misjudged, and we start really sort of disliking, not just disagreeing with, but disliking, feeling animus towards the other side. Now, many of you might work on social media, and so you can think of echo chambers, and there's been research on that done on social media. In this project, we look more at what we think of as real-life echo chamber. In other words, the sort of segregation that we might have geographically in our friendship zones. Much work has been done on how universities, in a sense, are fostering these echo chambers, because people are increasingly friends, highly educated people are friends with other people who are highly educated. They have the same outlook on life. In the UK, for example, with Brexit, education was a key dividing line. Highly educated people were much more likely to vote Remain. Less educated people were more likely to vote Brexit, and each of these groups had strong opinions about the other groups being intolerant, bigoted, wrong, lacking knowledge, and so on. So we'll look at whether or not these echo chambers, surrounding yourself with people of the same ideological or partisan outlook, whether that is a cause of both policy polarization, so ideological disagreement, and also affective polarization, so emotive, affective polarization. Now, there's a lot of observational evidence to suggest this, but what we want to do in this paper is trying to get a better causal handle on it. So we look at, first of all, I'll talk a bit about the polarizing, the theory behind why we might think that echo chambers can have this effect on people. Then I'll present the design of what is a lab in the field experiment. So we recruit a representative sample of partisans in the UK. I'll show you the results. And then we'll also go into some of the mechanism, actually looking at what happened in these groups. And the key treatment here is really a very simple one. It's whether or not you're surrounded in this echo chamber by people who happen to be all co-partisans. In Britain is a good setting for that, because there's sort of very dominant two-party systems, so either Labour or Conservatives, or whether you're in a mixed group. So that's the key treatment to keep in mind here. Now let's take a step back and think about what is this notion of affective polarization that has become so well studied in the US, of course, because it's something that they live with, but also increasingly across Europe and the world. It's the idea not just that we disagree politically, but that we have an emotional attachment to our partisan in-group and a sense of animosity towards the out-group. So it goes beyond, and even perhaps sometimes we might even not even disagree so much in policy terms, but we do disagree. We do have a strong sense of prejudice and hostility towards the out-group. And there's observational evidence showing that's on the rise, both in the US, but also across Europe. Now, why might that be? So there's, as I said, a big literature on that, especially in the US. Some of it points to that this might be from the elite. The elite polarization sort of trickles down. You see these politicians talking in a certain way, and then you adopt that. The media, increasingly, people are absorbing these very specialized media diets and only listening to people who think the same that they do. There's been a decline in cross-cutting identities. We live geographically in more and more homogeneous areas. We marry someone of the same education. We can specify it all on our social media dating apps, so we only get people who are more or less like us. And all of this sort of decline in cross-cutting identity might mean we are more operating in these echo chambers. There's also research showing how these sort of social surrounding can affect ideological polarization. Now let's think a bit more about why we might think partisan echo chambers having this effect on affective and policy polarization. So just in terms of what they are, they're really, the way we define it here is really environments where people encounter only the opinions and beliefs of like-minded partisans. You can think of other echo chambers, but we focus on partisanship. And there hasn't been that much in terms of real-life echo chambers, that much causal work, because of course we might see it observationally, and I'll show you some observational evidence, but it's hard to really sort of socially engineer people's networks and say, okay, now Mass, I'm going to put you just with I saw my family yesterday, so that's always sort of an interesting experiment in getting outside of your echo chamber politically, because all of a sudden, you leave the world of university and people have all sorts of opinions. There was someone there who was saying New Borley was great. I mean, I'm not lived in Denmark. I was like, really? But that's sort of and then, apparently, according to my own theory, I should then have started to feel more sympathy, and perhaps that's exactly right. That's a kind of, families are often these kind of echo chambers, getting out of the echo chambers when you meet the wider family. But often in our work environment and so on, we don't have that. But it's hard to really engineer it and say, okay, I'm going to put you 5 years in this echo chamber versus that, and really find out the causal effect. There has been some experimental work in the US, not surprisingly, in particular, where they're trying to have these mixed groups, but they often employ very strong deliberative norms, because in the US they're very worried about the state of democracy. So a lot of social scientists are working to deliberately try and come up with experiments that see, or if we really tell them Republicans are really great guys and we have this balanced, moderated discussion groups, do we then see that effect? And sometimes they do indeed see those effects. But what we wanted to do is saying, well, so in Britain you tend to meet people, not in a family setting. Where do you meet strangers and discuss politics? Or it's often in the pub. So the idea here is sort of what happens if you do meet someone down the pub and discuss an issue? Maybe you'll start talking about immigration. So one of the issues that's high on the political agenda in Britain at the moment is this idea that we are now going to send our asylum seekers to Rwanda, and I think Denmark is also quite inspired by that policy. And that's something that's quite divisive, quite emotional, and the two parties take very different policy positions on it. But if you meet a friend down the pub, you're not going to have someone saying, oh, actually, you should really listen to the pros and cons of this piece, and now we're going to show you have a little expert talking to you about it, like you have in deliberative forums. So we wanted to generate a kind of experiment where we randomized people into these different groups, but we had minimal moderation in terms of intervention in the discussion. So we were not trying to create balance as such. And also so there was no strong deliberative norms, and we took a topic that's likely to engender a lot of division. And other than Brexit, which is something else I study a lot, one of the things that people really disagree about in the UK is immigration. So that was the setup. So the theoretical expectation was that if you are in this echo chamber, if you're in the homogeneous group, you will become more effectively polarized. And there's big literature in social psychology of why that might be the case. One is social conformity theory. And the idea is when you're around like-minded people, there's a tendency that tends to reinforce your existing identities. You want to conform with the group. That gives you self-esteem. You feel like you belong. And part of that conforming to the group will also be to express allegiance to the group and to express hostility towards the outgroup. Whereas if you're sort of saying, oh, I'm a bit on the fence, that will come with a potential cost of being associated with being an outsider. On the other hand, if you're in a mixed group, if you're encountering, like I did last night, normally I use my co-author James Tilley as my example here, because we sort of disagree about everything, and I feel it's had to make me sort of more open-minded, because what do you engage in? And for example, intercontext theory showed you that. So last night when I was meeting my relative who votes for New Borley, I was like trying to do perspective taking. So I don't want to be rude. I come from London. I can't come in and say like, oh, don't they have views I don't agree with? So I would be, oh well, what are the reasons that you think they're the party to vote for? And that sort of perspective-taking and engagement, then you might learn from it and you start not to feel so much animosity and hostility towards the outgroup. Of course, there are other theories that might expect, a kind of backlash theory. There's studies in social media that shows, in fact, when you hear the other side, you get even more angry. But this was our theoretical expectation, that being in a mixed group, even when discussing something very emotional, you would have more empathy, more perspective-taking, and therefore less effective polarization. So the hypotheses are quite straightforward. One is about policy polarization, which is how much you ideologically disagree with the other group. And we think when you're in a homogeneous group, you're more polarized afterwards than if you're in a mixed group. And you're also more effectively polarized. You dislike, you have more hostility towards the outgroup and more attachment to your in-group compared to a mixed group. So before we ran the experiment, we thought, okay, can we look at some of that observationally? So that doesn't sort of give you a lot of causal leverage, but let's try and run a survey and see people who say they're just friends with like-minded partisans, so just conservatives or just Labour people, are they more or less effectively polarized? And what these simple graphs here show, what we have on the y-axis is the thermometer difference, which is one way of measuring effective polarization. So it's just how close you feel to your own party minus how far away you feel from the other party. And what we can see is that the thermometer difference, so the more sort of distance you have from the other party, is greater amongst those people who say, well, all my friends are conservatives or all my friends are Labour, whereas those who recognize they're surrounded by, they have a sort of more mixed social group, they feel less dislike towards the other group, in sort of less effectively polarized. Now, again, I'm not making any causal claims about this. We can think of the sort of causal direction going in both directions, but it does suggest that there's something here about certainly people who self-identify into partisan echo chambers that make them more effectively polarized. So we then pre-registered and designed this lab experiment where we said, okay, let's try and get people together and randomize them without their knowledge, into these groups and see what actually happens. Originally, we wanted to do this in person, but then COVID hit, and we didn't. And in a way, it turned out to be a sort of advantage for us because we could get really a very representative sample of the British population from the whole country and slightly lower cost, but also, old people, young people, everyone were talking to their grandchildren on Zoom. And so they had become very used to having these discussions on Zoom in a way that I think we couldn't have really conducted that study pre-COVID. So we moved to do it on Zoom, but we still, we tried to, as I said, replicate as much as possible real-life discussion in terms of, I'll tell you a bit more about how the topic was introduced, but it was sort of, it was not a kind of deliberative experiment in the sense that we had a strongly moderated. The treatment, I already said, is very simple, either homogeneous or heterogeneous group, and the topic was immigration. We surveyed them before they went in. We then randomized them to groups, and we then surveyed them afterwards. And I'll first show you the results of the pre-post survey experiment, and then I will do some analysis of what happened in these groups. One of the things we really wanted to do, often you see experiments in psychology and also even in political science that's sort of done with students. Now, I know maybe you think, oh, well, they're sort of representative. I have my doubts, especially when it's a topic like that. They're really representative. And also, it's quite hard to find enough conservative students in the UK, although in Oxford might be one place. But we wanted really like a representative sample of the population. So we recruited through Facebook, which is by far the biggest social media platform in the UK. About 75% use it, and we have a lot of data to show that they're quite representative of the population. And certainly our sample is very representative of the population, except for one thing: they're more interested in politics. Now, that's not surprising, because we recruited them by saying, hey, do you want to come and talk about politics for an hour? Well, I mean, of course you get more people who are, and also our population here were only partisans. Because remember, the treatment is that you get put into group either with only like-minded partisans or in a mixed group, so we could only have partisans. So they look a lot like other partisans, but a bit more interested in politics. So we ran all of these ads on Facebook. That's for another time. And then we ended up with 724 participants in this study. They were then shown a topic video to introduce the topic. And the good thing was this was a bill that was going through Parliament at the time, so we could say, we're just interested in normal people's views on this topic, and then we're going to write an article, which I still have to write, so I'm not deceiving them, about what do normal people think about this new immigration bill? You know, what do we think about making certain immigrants illegal and sending them to Rwanda, and so on. And in the video, there were partisan cues in that. It was a video we'd put together from debates in the House of Commons. So you were presenting the Conservative view and the Labour view, and they are quite clearly opposing on this issue. So this is sort of some stills from this video, and you can see they were given this. We surveyed them, as I said beforehand, so Labour and Conservative partisans were very far apart on the issue already. They were kind of an average. Labour was 2.4 on a 10-point scale, and Conservatives were like 8.6 or something. So they didn't really agree coming into this. Conservatives were very supportive, and Labour were, even before they'd seen that cue. Now we wanted to know, comparing these two groups, what happened to policy polarization and affective polarization, and so we used the most sort of conservative modeling strategy, where we look at pre to post within individual pre-post difference in change in both policy polarization, which were a lot of agreement measures with this new immigration policy, and affective polarization, which there's a big debate for those of you who know that literature about how to measure it. So we measured in all the ways we could think of, the standard thermometer scale, but also a battery on partisan identification and a battery at outgroup hostility, both outgroup hostility towards the party and towards party supporters. So just, I'll show you some graphs, but this is policy polarization, and what it shows that the homogeneous group clearly increased in policy polarization compared to mixed groups. Putting it differently, also mixed group, they become closer together. They didn't meet in the middle. You know, they weren't sort of in perfect agreement, but this is the marginal effect on difference on this new immigration plan between wave 1 and wave 2. And what we see is that in a homogeneous group, the Conservatives become more supportive and Labour becomes less supportive than before. So that's in line with some studies. We've already seen that when you're in an echo chamber, you become even more extreme after you have discussed than if you're not. Now, we were interested also in, well, does that translate into how you feel about the other group as opposed to just how you feel about the policy? You know, seeing a conservative person, if you're a Labour person across the room saying, yes, we should send them all to Rwanda, does that make you, oh yeah, like them more, or does it make you like them less? You'll recall that the hypothesis was it will make you like them more. And that is, in fact, what we find. So you can see over here, the blue and gray, pre-treatment. You can see on the y-axis there we have affective polarization. And there are no differences between people who are randomized into a homogeneous group and people who are or an echo chamber, or people who are randomized into a mixed group. And what you see there is post-treatment, and you can see they've really moved apart, and it's quite a lot. So if you were gray, if you were in the echo chamber, you become more effectively polarized. If you're with the other side, you become less effectively polarized, and that's significant. Now I could stop there and say, oh, look, this was like all what we pre-registered, it was very nice. But what we also did was we did break it down and see, is this driven more by one group or the other? And is that more the Labour partisans, or is it more conservative partisans? And there, of course, we're starting to have sort of a bit of power issues when you start breaking this down. But just to say that, if you do break it down into those groups, you do find it's mainly driven by Labour partisans. In other words, they're the ones who become more effectively polarized when they're with their own. Now, I don't have the answer to it, which we tried very hard to find. I think it's driven a bit by Labour, the losers, they are in your position, and when you're a loser and you're with the other losers, I mean, I'm not saying they're losers, but they're losers in the political system, and they're not the ones introducing that. You get together with others like you're really angry with the government. That has more of an effect. We certainly see the stronger treatment effect on Labour. Now, the final part of this presentation is just I want to say a little bit about, that's fine, we found these effects, which were the ones we pre-registered, but what happened in the discussion? And going back to the theory, do the sort of things we expect to happen, do they happen? And if we go back and think about what social insights from social psychology and the use of emotions in politics, we would expect that if you're in this echo chamber, you might be more emotive and less reasoned, especially negative emotions, because if you have this hostility and prejudice about an animus towards the other side. So that's what we'd expect to see in the groups where you were with your own side. Whereas, what is it we expect to see when we're all of a sudden encountering people from the other side? We would expect, again, according to the theory, that you would expect a more reflective reasoning, more engagement, more perspective taking. So we transcribed all of these discussions. Well, they know we transcribed it, so it wasn't like entirely deceptive. And then we're in the process of doing some text analysis on what happened. And I'm going to show you a first cut of it, but we're sort of developing more machine learning approach so it can be used in other settings as well. But what we're expecting is, first of all, as I said, that we'll see more emotive, more effective language in the echo chambers, and also more, in contrast, more recent language, more reflection in the mixed groups, and also more uncertainty. Because again, what happens when we all know that great feeling, everyone agrees with you. In fact, they said it afterwards. They said, oh, I really feel so great about Britain now. Because, they wanted to chat. Because I feel that so many people don't know anything, but now I feel really reassured. I met this great group of people. They have great opinions. I thought, yeah, because we picked them to agree with you anyway. But they were sort of really reassured. I'm thinking about the state of Britain. It's terrible. But they were sort of very positive. So if you're in a group like that where everyone agrees with you, you just think, God, they have brilliant opinions. They're just like my opinions. You express a lot of certainty. No, this Tory policy in Rwanda, it's terrible. But what happens when you meet this relative of mine who has a different, I have to sort of think, maybe I will still say the same thing, but I express it with a lot less certainty. I don't say, oh, this is a morally corrupt policy. I say, well, have you considered this person might have traveled a long way from Africa, and So what we also expect is more uncertainty expressed, less certitude in the mixed groups, because that's how we engage with people That's how we think we engage with people when you're in mixed groups. So as a first cut, we used, some of you might be familiar with the LIWC dictionary, which is something that's been validated by linguistic psychologists, and they have different dictionaries, so it's kind of very straightforward dictionary approach. To measure emotions, we use the affective processing category, and to measure reason and perspective taking, we use the cognitive processing category, and we also measure the certainty. And we control, interestingly, in all of these models for the partisanship, timing of the survey, because this policy became more and more kind of contested, pre-level affective polarization, so we're controlling for how effectively they're polarized beforehand, and gender. Now, which of these controls, this is my quiz question, which of these controls do you think come out very strongly significant in all of our models? I'm not going to show you the controls, it's just... Any guesses? It's not partisanship, Claes. Yes. My co-author, who's male, does not understand because he works with me. So he's like, why would women, I don't know any women who are like quiet, subservient. But yeah, but in these models, women come out consistently less dominant, less emotive, less negatively emotive, more reasoned, less certain, all of these things you'd expect. And that was not, but it's just interesting. Not the others, even pre-level affective polarizations. Anyway, now let's look at some of the results. So, emotive language. What we find is high levels of negative emotion used in the homogeneous groups, not positive emotion. That's not significantly different. So people just use a lot of them when they're with their own group. They are really kind of use quite negative emotion. On the other hand, we find in a mixed group higher levels of recent the sort of language that suggests recent dialogue and engagement, and less certainty as expected. So what we're doing now is trying to sort of develop these measures, obviously not developed specifically for our hypothesis. So we are, as I said, developing this machine learning approach now where we are specifically doing a training data set with engagement, reason and logic, also moral argument, to see if they use, in certain groups, use more morality, uncertainty, and affect. So that's the next step, but I don't have the results from that yet. So to wrap up, we wanted to test, do these echo chambers have the sort of effect we might expect in a more causal setting? We weren't interested in particularly, and we're not saying necessarily we would think we'd find exactly the same effect on social media, but we wanted to expect when you see people face to face, when they see the other side, does that make you less effectively polarized? Whereas when you're just with your like-minded partisans, do you get more extreme, both effectively and on policy views? And we did find that effect. And that suggests that these echo chambers can exacerbate some of these negative consequences of partisan divides. But it also implies, because we saw this within person change, that when you are exposed to the other side, you might actually look at them less negatively than you did before. And that suggests that there might be something positive in having settings where we are not just surrounded by like-minded people. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
For the recording, please. For the recording, please ask in the mic. You're holding it?
Yeah, I think this one works.
Hi. Oh, wow, it's very strong. Thanks for the really interesting presentation. I was thinking about your result that suggested it was mostly on the labor side, that there was a change of mind. Could it be related to the specific issue of immigration? So, I don't know, maybe for some reason that's an issue that sparks more anger among labor supporters, while maybe another issue would produce different results more on the conservative side? Thanks.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, of course, one drawback with this design is that we don't look at it across different issues. So in that sense, I'm limited. What I do have measures of is the saliency attached to the issue going in, and it's not like it was a more salient issue for Labour than the Conservative partisans in our group. In fact, some might argue that, given what happened with Brexit, in fact, it's quite salient to a lot of sort of Conservative Brexiteers. So we don't find those differences. I mean, one of the things we did, which is a sort of to exclude alternative explanations, the one I can't exclude was the one I gave to you, which is it's a kind of government opposition loser-winner dynamics, because of course that's overlapping with. But we didn't find any differences in the saliency attached to this, or even also things like the personality trait, the level of affective polarization. I can't tell you, of course, it would be nice to have it across other issues. There is this one paper by Fiskin and co-authors in the APSR in 21, where they look in the US, look across what is the effect of deliberation. So they don't look at group composition, just deliberating. And does the deliberation in itself, pre-post, lead to less affective polarization? And they do find, these are all mixed groups, and they find in all of these mixed groups that deliberating across all the 5 issues, one of them being immigration, that it has that effect. So, but this sort of heterogeneous treatment effect, I don't know if that's the case. I can only say that it wasn't measurably more salient to Labour supporters. But I would like to, if I have more money, and I have enough patience to recruit through Facebook again, I will. I would like to do it across more issues. I think it's a very good point.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I have a question about your findings that showed that in the mixed groups, people, with respect to the specific policy about immigration, kind of moderated their views a bit after, speaking to people from the other side. And I was curious if you were interested in how long that sort of result holds, because I would imagine that it probably doesn't last very long. Yeah. In other words, like, as soon as they go back into their sort of respective spheres, they sort of move on or forget or just revert back to the norm. Is that something that you tracked at all?
So that's another great question. First of all, what we expect, and I think I broadly agree with you, and that's partly, we didn't go back to these people. There are studies showing that these effects kind of decay quite quickly, and I would expect that. On the other hand, it's also in a sense, what are we trying to generalize to? I guess I'm trying to generalize whether you only have friends who are in your kind of rough partisan sphere, and in that sense, that treatment is pretty constant, as opposed to if you have a group of friends who are mixed and all of a sudden expose you to different views and a lot of issues. Would I expect that kind of 1 hour this happens? If I went back to them now, a year later? Probably not. I don't have the answer, but I'm entirely in agreement with your intuition. On the other hand, what we're trying to generalize to is this idea that you're living in partisan echo chambers, and you just never really hear the other side, except being sort of referred to by people who are critical of it, as opposed to continuously being, okay, well, I have this view on it. So that's why I would expect, like you do, that it's a short-lived effect, but I think it's nonetheless interesting to see, even with this quite 45-minute discussion, you see these very robust and significant effects in how people view other people.
Well, thanks for a really great talk. I guess I'm thinking about differences between Denmark and the United States. My sense is that the partisan divide isn't as bad in Denmark as it is in the United States. And I guess my hypothesis would be that one of the differences could be a two-party system versus a multi-party system, a parliamentary system, because there are more nuanced views that can be packed into different parties. I don't know. Maybe that's the wrong hypothesis, but do you have some explanation? I mean, we have the same social media here in Denmark as there is in the United States. Do you have an explanation as to why the partisan politics might not be quite as divided here?
So there is a lot of comparative. So I agree again. I mean, first I'll say there is a lot of comparative work using a lot of the thermometer scores that find, even some study that find that Norway is apparently more effectively polarized than the US. I'm a little skeptical of this. I mean, in a sense, I think the US at this point in time, I think we have a lot of evidence suggesting it's very effectively polarized, and there's a big literature suggesting that some of it has to do with just these sort of segregation in a lot of different ways, socially, geographically, that you have this decline. For example, Lily Mason has written a great book on this decline in these cross-cutting identities in the US. And I think the political system, which you point to, is also part of it. which is this idea that when everything becomes very binary and you're sort of forced into like one camp and you're attached with that, and everything, the other, becomes a very clear, singular other, then you'd imagine that leads to greater affective polarization. I've done quite a bit of work on that in the context of the Brexit referendum in the UK, where sort of soft, mixed Euroscepticism all of a sudden be crystallized into this binary alternative. You're either on this side or you're on the other, and all of a sudden that other became something that you disliked and hated quite a lot. So I do think, not all, of course, also when you have elite polarization, as you do in the US, which you haven't always had in the US, of course you've had much less elite polarization than you have now. I think that can contribute to it. So Britain is an interesting case because it's probably somewhere in between the US right now and Denmark. In the sense that, but I do think there's something about the binary other. If you all of a sudden you put a lot into that, or you think, oh, it's the party, and it comes to encapsulate a lot of things that makes affective polarization. So that would also be my intuition. There is, as I said, some comparative work that suggests, oh, in fact, affective polarization is not a lot higher in the US. Not my own work, but not a lot higher in the US than in Europe. But I think I would agree with you that the adversarial nature of the party system is sort of, you can think about it even just in terms of sort of coalition formation. If, the parties in Denmark know, most of them, that they'll probably, if they want to get into government, have to work together with some others in some form or another, and even now across the center. Now that gives you very different incentive in how you talk about the other party. And of course that kind of elite queuing, Claes has worked on that and others, could also then filter down into voters. So I think the sort of binary, when you have highly polarized elite parties, some of that also filter down to voters. So I think I agree with that intuition, although it's not, obviously I don't look at Denmark in this paper, but quite deliberately I picked the UK, well, I also live there, but because it has that two-party nature that makes this kind of experiment possible, but it's not the US, so we're not in a place where it's that level of effective polarization. But a very good question, and I think political systems can contribute to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, this was a version of the same question actually, but maybe it can be put a little bit sharper, that it really comes down to the first past the post voting system, doesn't it? That a third or even a fourth party cannot really emerge in the US, but also not in the UK or in any other of the UK's former colonies where this first past the post system has been inherited. So if you think of Germany, for instance, isn't there a tendency there that you also have the media clustering not around two sides, but actually around 3 or 4, which could never happen in a first past the post voting system? So as I said before, I do think that the binary makes these kind of not just the policy polarization, because it's not always, in fact, there was a long period in British politics where in a sort of Downsian way they complained about the two parties. Well, not that they were too extreme, but that they were too similar. And I think we are a bit after a period in the UK, and the same in the US, there were periods where the parties were not so far apart. So if we think of kind of a standard political science model, what a first past the post system should generate politically would in fact be parties that are quite close together, and whereas what you get in a PR system is more polarization, certainly at the extremes. So that's the sort of the standard answer. Now we do see these parties going through ebbs and flows, and some of that has to do with that they're not only ever reacting to voters, but also to partisan activists and so on. And we've seen some of that with the Labour Party that was captured by a sort of left-wing flank with Corbyn, so they went quite, and then Brexit basically produced something very similar with the Conservative Party that got captured by a more extreme flank of their party. So, but I think what is happening now in the UK, that the UK is sort of moving back in a sort of Downsian fashion more towards the centre. So that's the sort of partisan. Another thing is, I guess, is what happens at the voter level. And I think while that is influenced by elite queuing, it is not only about that. So whether, you and I might be from two different parties, I might be conservative, you might be Labour, but it might still be that socially, I'm like, yeah, we disagree on that policy, but what is it that makes us dislike each other and think that we are just fundamentally different people? Because what we talk about with affective polarization is that spills over into this sort of sense of hostility, prejudice, that this other person just is not acting in good faith, is sort of fundamentally somehow have the wrong views, not just politically disagreement. And I think that's where the social fabric of society, and that's why I wanted to look at, it's more than just something different than just, okay, we disagree on a policy, when we start disliking each other as groups in society. And so while electoral systems do something in terms of structuring politics, I don't think we can just talk about institutions when we talk about affective polarization. And that's where, for example, in the US, there's very interesting work on how these big long-term changes in the sort of in how people live, how they're educated, how they have contributed to an increase in affective polarization in the US. So I'm very interested, obviously, as a political scientist in electoral systems, but still I don't think they can explain everything. Thank you.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff. I have a question and a suggestion. The question with regards to the textual analysis, were the results different between the pure conservative, the pure Labour group? And another suggestion, maybe it could be interesting, perhaps that's a future project, to look at which specific words are correlated at the individual level with higher levels of affective partisanship. So it could be interesting to see what are the words that are driving, or at least correlated with being more angry on the other side. Which word do you use when you're really, really angry at the other side?
Okay, thank you. So that's great. So I was just trying to think about your suggestion. So would you look at like so the affective polarization levels in the survey, and then see people who are highly affectively polarized, do they use other words? Is that the idea?
Yeah. You could do it the other way. It's what are dependent and independent variable, but it could be interesting to see the correlation.
Yeah.
Which kind of words are more correlated with being more effective polarized? Which words? I would guess they use different words of those who are not that as angry at the other side.
No, that's a good idea. We could certainly do that. Thank you for that. In terms of your first question, so as you saw, we included control for partisanship, and as I revealed, it's apparently all about gender. No, so we don't see. It's really about, we find this strong treatment effect of whether or not you're in one group and the other, but it's not that like the conservatives, when they're in the mixed groups, they're still negatively motivated or not. So that there's not a significant effect on partisanship. No. But yeah, we did look at that. But I will take up that suggestion. Always I like that we have all this very exciting textual data. Next thing is I wanted to look at sort of their facial expressions. But it's unfortunately not everyone. You saw these Zoom pictures I had in the advertising where they all sit there nicely lit and stuff, and it's perfect. But of course, when people are on real Zoom, there's like half a face, and like it's a little bit harder to do this analysis than you're sort of in a sort of laboratory setting. In fact, like the most difficult thing with running these experiments was getting people to change their Zoom name to a number, because through the ethics approval, they couldn't have their names on, and like people have a really hard time changing their Zoom name. So that was like half an hour we had to add on to everything. That's another story, but thank you for that suggestion.
Yeah, thank you very much for your interesting talk, and I really liked the design that you employed. Could you just repeat how many homogeneous groups there was? So how many labor groups and how many groups for the conservatives? And I was wondering if you saw any differences between the groups. So maybe that there were certain groups with a lot of polarization and others with less polarization. And if you looked into what was actually happening there, was there specific dynamics in this group where you saw more polarization or somebody dominating the discussion?
So it was 80, so I don't have now I have to 86 groups. And so half of them were homogeneous, and half of those were Labour and Conservative, and half of those were mixed. Actually, so the big spending here was trying to get enough Conservatives. Which there are lots of Labour people wanting to talk about politics. And again, that was a sort of concern. Is it just the Labour people? James said it's because they don't have a job.
They sit at home. But, in fact, some labor voters do have a job. But that's something that's also been found in the US. So it was mixed. And what was the other?
If you looked, if there were certain groups where there was a lot of affective polarization within the homogeneous groups, and if there was something specific going on there, for example,
well, so they're
specific dynamics.
balanced, yeah. So what we're doing is, of course, the balance checks. And the groups, the homogeneous versus the mixed groups, are perfectly balanced and pre-treatment affective polarization. So there are not any systematic differences at all, as you would expect. But of course, we check it. But as you'd expect with randomizations, there are no differences like that. There's also, we try to do so a lot of other things in terms of looking, with the labor conservatives, that labor people just have very different personality traits and so on. So we didn't find any, but there's no systematic differences between the two types of groups. Again, that's the sort of that's the advantage of the randomized, but we did check that, so we don't find any differences. There's lots of different ways I would like to cut this, as you can imagine. This sort of, what happened in this, like, for example, one of the things that is quite interesting is what happens if you have, like, a very dominant person speaking in a certain way who's the first person in the group. So the one thing we perhaps can do is something with the first person, but generally there is a limit to how much we can cut these groups, and we already end up working with a sort of quite small n. So the fact we find these very robust results across, I think, is already kind of good. So while there's more things I would like to do, we'd really need to have just a much bigger n. I think already getting sort of close to 800 people discussing is quite a lot of people, but it's once you start slicing it up, you really don't have that much to work with. So there's lots of things I would like to do that I simply can't do.
Yeah, I have a question. So first, thank you very much for this interesting talk, and I appreciate that you also look at what happened in the groups and not just the effect, which is two things that I think should be looked at the same time. I would like to ask you about your thoughts on the implications of your research, and kind of you alluded earlier to there are so many trends in society that reinforce. It's not just social media. There are things where people live, where people work, that seem to reinforce this polarization. What do you think are places of mixing that we should kind of try to strengthen or preserve that could lead to like a depolarization, or at least maybe put a break on polarization? I'm curious what you think about this, other than pubs.
Yeah, pubs are great. There's actually, I have a PhD student, and I will get to your question. It's a great question. I have a PhD student, former PhD student, Darren Boley, who wrote this paper on, this was actually voting for UKIP, but the radicalization of the closure of pubs. Sort of when people didn't have a place to go to where they could meet their mates. So that's it for another time. And it was very interesting when a sort of neighborhood pub closes down, people really feel aggrieved. So that's a key advantage of living in the UK with the pubs. But what are the policy implications? It's a great question, because in a sense it comes back to, I guess, the normative implication is in this, that it would, if we think affective polarization is a bad thing, which I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that we disagree politically about things, but I think it's a bad thing if we sort of stereotype one group and think they're just bad people, they're ignorant. These questions of sort of interpersonal affective polarization, I mean, this is quite negative, yeah. It's not, I don't think it's good for democratic dialogue to have that. And if that's the implication, that's bad, and that is exacerbated by living in these echo chambers. The question then becomes, okay, well, if you're a policy person, which granted I'm not, what do you do to prevent that? And it goes back a bit to the question also, society, US versus Denmark and stuff. And I already think living in the UK versus Denmark, you can certainly see that this is a country that on so many levels is so much more segregated. That's to do, with housing policy, do people live just around similar people, but also schooling, what are the big institutions we have in society that make sure that we meet people who are not exactly like us on every dimension? And schools are one. Another example of this, which there's actually been an interesting paper on recently on affective polarization, is conscription. So that's obviously only for one half of the of the population. But there's still conscription in Denmark, isn't there? But for, I guess, a increasingly small. So I don't know. My father went to work in some feminist movement instead of going into conscription. So I don't know what I think about conscription, but from the perspective of mixing with other people, that is really an example where you just put in with the rest of the population. Yeah, it's really not segregated. So there is this paper, now I forget the author, there's a working paper that shows that with the decline of conscription across the world, that has led to an increase in the places where they gave it up, an increase amongst males in affective polarization. In other words, you could argue that conscription is it. So that's just one policy example. I'm not saying we should have conscription just to so people don't dislike the other side, but it's an example of this is a place where you just meet. Or if you have schools and neighborhoods that are generally mixed, as opposed to and I guess another thing is going back is the elite effect. How do elites talk about the other side? Because I think people also listen. But so I think these are the sort of bigger policy implications. And of course also it goes to things like inequality, because often when you have very high levels of inequality, that prices certain groups out of certain neighborhoods and so on. So I think there's much bigger potentially societal implications. And I think and what we do see and James Noam Gidron and Jim Adams and so have a book on the bigger institutional and economic determinants of affective polarization, and they see some of those effects. Thank you.
And I have the prerogative of moving towards the closing of the session, but not before I get to ask a question of my own. But first of all, I of course wanted to say, you started off by saying, I'm not going to deal with the media and the effects of the media. And then your treatment is actually showing a clip, a video, which is of course a media effect that you were actually inserting into your design. But that's not my question. My question is actually your thoughts about sort of boundary conditions and the dynamics of what we're looking at here, right? Because all the theories about affective polarization are essentially theories about change, and it's a process. And you also found the movement towards extremity or towards reduced affective polarization. So what does that mean when we think about this in sort of the more dynamic nature of trying to understand when does this kick in? It goes a little bit back to the question of longevity. How long do these effects last? What are the moments in which we can either be re-exposed to these kind of conditions where you can have some kind of maintenance level so that you are constantly reminded, oh yeah, I really dislike my opponents, or that you have these exposures that lead you to revisit that. So what are the sort of the dynamics of this phenomenon if we accept from the outset that this is a process that has boundary conditions at some point, right? So the affective polarization can also not, there's a roof, there's a limit somewhere, and there's a bottom somewhere. So just your thoughts on that as the final question.
Just on the media, there's a long history to this, you should all know, that Claes always thinks I don't take the media seriously enough. So that's the context of that. I guess what I meant here is, and it goes a bit to the boundary conditions, is that I don't want to make any claims about whether we'd expect the same on social media. And that's because I'm wondering, which I'm not testing, but I'm wondering whether part of the kind of depolarization you find in this quite short interaction is because you just see people. Whereas if I was in a mixed group of some anonymous trolls or whatever faces they have, and they're like shouting, oh, this is a great policy, or this is a terrible policy, would it have the same effect? And I'm not sure. So that's part of that. What are the scope conditions of it in terms of, does it translate into, or you just get people on like some chat GPT room and get, you create this artificially. And I think maybe part of it, which is not, again, what I'm testing, but I think part of it might be that human condition that you're talking to a real person who disagrees with you. And let's not forget, while there was a depolarizing effect in the mixed group, they still really disagreed at the end. I mean, they move, but it's not like they're like, oh yeah, I take that policy, it's great. Labour, or the other way around, the Conservatives were like, oh, actually now I realize it's awful, why are we doing this? It's not like that. They just moved a bit closer and they talked a bit differently. So of course, like always, there's this trade-off in these sort of studies. Okay, how generalizable is it? How many issues can we look at how? And this is clearly at the sort of spectrum of things where it's a very narrow, very controlled, and it creates certain challenges in terms of generalization. as opposed to the other. I do, for example, sort of more observational work with this, where you find these patterns, as I showed you, and you find these patterns, quite consistently, and I'm interested in sort of how this happens over life. But then that has that other challenge that, what is it really? Is it people self-select? Certain types of people self-select into echo chambers. So there's always that tension, and I think that's very much also a tension in this study. But one of the things, other than doing the cross issue, I would like to do is saying, what if you regenerate some of that in a space that a lot of people are in, like social media? Do you, in fact, maybe you get a complete backfire effect, because that's what some studies have found, that when you, in more organically created, when you introduce the other side on social media, people really actually get more effectively polarized. So is it really necessary that we get together and we meet each other? So, but I guess, again, as I've said before, what I would expect is that the way in which the dynamics of this is that if we are in echo chambers, that's being reinforced all the time, because we only ever hear our own voice repeated back to us, as opposed to if we are in mixed groups, we have to reflect on and think about these other points of view. And we might not end up agreeing, but we maybe demonize the other side less.
I think the point of being together in the same room, being something positive, is a great way to end. Sara, I want to thank you a lot for an inspiring talk. It's great to have you back at SDU, and we look forward to working with you in the context of the Digital Democracy Center in the future. And Pantelis and others will be broadcasting out when our next talk is, which is in about a month from now. Thank you very much for showing up today, and a big warm applause for you, Sara.